Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're seeing some folks start to join the webinar or the movement call. We're going to get started in just a bit, but we're just going to let more folks, give folks a moment to continue to join and get settled. And really excited for the panel today. Felt like the Beyonce was a good way to start and get the energy going.
I've got my shirt on and everything.
Oh, yes. I thought that's what that was.
Folks are showing off their backgrounds and their shirts today.
I think Meagan wins though.
Well, we're about to delve into something that's a huge bummer, so celebrate where you can.
Yeah, I think, it's a Monday and it's the evening, late afternoon. So yeah, we definitely need that energy. Cool. Well, we're going to get started in just a moment. I think, yeah, always a little reminder to grab your water, grab your whatever, so you can be comfy while you sit and listen to this amazing panel. All right. All right. Well, I think we're going to begin. This is a great, we have people joining still, but time is limited and we want to respect everyone's evening and afternoons here. So I'm going to mute the music, I'm going to turn it down, practice my DJ transition skills. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to begin the recording here. Oh, it's already going. Good. So hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jade Begay. I am the Policy and Advocacy Director at Indian Collective. And again, just so grateful to you all for taking some time out of your day to really, just come to this call and check in. That's kind of the purpose of this call. We're not necessarily mobilizing all of you to do anything. I'm sure our speakers will have, call to actions and resources to share, but I think there is just a lot going on across our various parts of the larger movement ecosystem, and sometimes we can get really, in the weeds with our specific kind of work. So it felt really important to host a check-in post SCOTUS decisions, as we see more and more attacks from the far right, from the GOP on our rights. And also as we see number 45, gain popularity and traction right now, and just have this moment to hear from, again, various parts of the broader movement ecosystem on how we're addressing this, how we're interpreting or seeing the threats, and what we can do, and how we can, rise to the movement, to the moment. I want to share that I was on a call yesterday evening with a dear comrade and colleague from Hawaii. He's actually from Lahaina and in Maui, and he was speaking to how, as organizers, in these moments where just it's really overwhelming, there's so much going on, so many fights to fight, that as organizers and in true, island fashion, he compared it to, not feeling really bogged down by the so much to take care of, but really, he compared it to surfing, and like when there's a big wave coming, we don't stop. In fact, you start paddling and you start observing and looking around so that you can ride that wave and make it out safe. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor for our work. And right now in this moment, seeing all the different things going on across the country, all of the attacks, all of the injustice, there's definitely moments and times for holding space for grief and for the overwhelm, but I also feel very energized because there are so many people like the people we have in this panel today who are so knowledgeable and so wise and so smart about how we're going to address all of these various issues, and they have plans for how we're going to win. And so I'm just excited, so grateful and excited to hear from each of the speakers today, and really so that we can just communicate and share how we're seeing, what's going on, and so that we can be that much more informed and insightful as organizers or as regular people on how we can get involved and take action. So thank you again. We're gonna get started soon with our questions and our Q&A, but first I want to intro the co-host here and my dear colleague and friend, Talia. So over to you, Talia.
Imanaja, Mashikuna, Yuka Shutimi, Talia, Yarina, Ecuador, Otavalo, Jactamanda, Yupechani. Hi, everyone. My name is Talia Carol Cachimuel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Quichua Otavalo from Ecuador, and I'm the Director of Movement and Strategic Partnerships at NDN Collective. I feel super honored and grateful to be sharing this space today with this amazing set of panelists and my colleague, Jade, to really run through and talk about what's happening and the steps that we can take to continue to protect our communities. As an Indigenous activist and organizer, I see the detrimental implications of these decisions and how they have an impact on the critical movement work that we want to move forward. And it's essential that we center the voices of the people that these decisions are impacting by creating inclusive spaces such as this one for folks to express their ongoing concerns and recommendations for mobilizing so that we can uplift one another. I also think it's really important to understand how the organizing that happens on the ground impacts the policy and impacts the decisions that we see. And I think it's really important that we're gathered here today to have these important conversations. So with that, I'm going to begin introducing you all to the amazing set of speakers that we have with us, starting with Meagan Hatcher-Mays. Meagan Hatcher-Mays is a lawyer and Indivisible's Director of Democracy Policy. Prior to joining Indivisible, Meagan fought the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation as counsel for Demand Justice, and before that served as a counsel for the District of Columbia's non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives, Eleanor Holmes Norton. She lives in Washington, D.C. And next we have Anthony Vidal Torres, who is the Communications Director for Get Free. Anthony is a messaging specialist, political strategist, and organizer originally from Long Island, New York. He's supported winning campaigns across the country and most recently served as the Director of Collaboration at ASO Communications and has been a key steward and trainer of the race class narrative. Prior to this, he led communication efforts for the National Grassroots Campaign to impeach Trump in 2019 and held a variety of leadership roles in the climate movement. And also from Get Free, today we have Nicole Carty. Nicole is the Executive Director of Get Free. Nicole is a movement strategist, narrative specialist, campaigner, and trainer born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, with almost a decade of experience studying and supporting movements to further racial, gender, and economic justice. As a movement practitioner in Occupy Wall Street and the Movement for Black Lives, and a strategist and core team member at Momentum, Nicole has spent her career developing her craft regarding what makes movements strategic, impactful, and successful.
Thanks, Talia. I'm going to take it from here and intro the rest of the crew. So next we have Matthew Fletcher, professor of law at Michigan Law. Matthew is the Harry Burns Hutchins Collegiate Professor of Law at Michigan Law. He teaches and writes in the areas of federal Indian law, American Indian tribal law, Anishinaabe legal and political philosophy, constitutional law, federal courts, and legal ethics. He also sits as the Chief Justice of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. Sorry if I mispronounce. The Poarch Band of Creek Indians and the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. Thanks for being here, Matthew. And then last but not least, we have Shelby Chestnut of Transgender Law Center. Shelby began their tenure as the executive director of the Transgender Law Center, the largest national trans-led organization advocating for a world in which all people are free to define themselves and their future. Shelby has over 20 years of community organizing, policy advocacy, and leadership experience in the LGBTQ and anti-violence movements. They previously served for 5 years as TLC, Transgender Law Center's Director of Policy and Programs. Shelby is the first Native Trans Executive Director of TLC and is one of the first Native trans leaders to head a national LGBT organization. Thank you, Shelby, for being here. And back to you, Talia.
Thank you, Jade, and thank you everyone for being here. You are all so incredible, and we're deeply honored to be sharing this space with y'all today. We don't have a ton of time, but we have so much to talk about, so let's dive right in. I'm gonna direct this first question to Nicole and Anthony. You all recently launched Get Free, a youth-led movement to repair past harms, remove ongoing barriers to equality, and realize a future where freedom is for all. Also, last month, you all led a series of actions in DC to take a stand for our collective future. I had the honor of joining y'all in DC, standing outside of the SCOTUS building and rallying with the Get Free folks. And I was so impressed with the organizing that went down, that took place, the diverse group of speakers, the route that y'all took to get from one building to the other. I thought it was an extremely well-organized action with an extremely clear message. So could you all share why you are building Get Free? And could you speak specifically as to why you are targeting the supremacist faction? And also, by the way, who is that?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad that you thought the action was well executed. That feels like validation for many months of work that we all worked on. So yeah, Get Free is a new youth-led movement. And it actually has been in development for a number of years. Jade actually was part of our team. And we came together as a group of young people who really were eager to get to the root of a lot of the problems we were experiencing in our nation. And so we, like many activists who are possibly on this call, saw a whole slew of attacks on our freedoms and threats to our democracy and racial injustices, gender injustices, and we came together to get at the root. And so Get Free is really about making repair of these supremacist policies mainstream, both publicly and politically. The problems that we're facing right now are not new problems, they're old problems, and they really stem back to slavery and genocide. They are built upon lies and laws of racial, gender, supremacy that have really been designed in order to justify exploitation of us in order to benefit a wealthy white few. So we often talk about, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, but we don't always understand that these are all systems about control and empowering a wealthy few in order to divide and exploit the rest. And so this agenda, the supremacy agenda, has always been here in this country. And it has been shaping our realities through Jim Crow, through slavery, through Native genocide. It gave us George Wallace, it gave us Donald Trump. And now, once again, this country is really at a crossroads moment with this agenda. The reason why it's at a crossroads is because right now we have an ascending generation who is the most diverse generation in American history. And they are coming up in full force against this long, entrenched agenda that is being moved by who we call the supremacist faction, this wealthy few who has designed these systems since before America was even a country. And we are organizing young people in order to fight back against this agenda and to realize a future where equality and freedom is for all. And so when we went to DC, we went in reaction to the SCOTUS rulings because we were really clear that what was happening and what is happening in SCOTUS and around the country is really the supremacy agenda in action. The Supreme Court itself has been handpicked by this faction who is trying to move the supremacy agenda. They chose the people on the court, they chose the cases, they bankrolled the cases that were seen this session in the Supreme Court. And if you look at the composite of what actually passed, there's a really clear agenda underway. And that agenda is about basically protecting systems of hierarchy and making it harder and more difficult for us to actually heal inequality or repair past wounds, especially against Black and Brown communities, Black and Indigenous communities especially. And so the rulings that we saw were ending affirmative action, greenlining discrimination against the LGBT community, but really all protected classes. And of course, ending the cancellation of student debt, trampling on treaty rights. And the agenda underneath all of this is really to freeze inequality in place and to freeze power in place for this wealthy few. There's an attempt underway here to revise history. And what I mean by that is in the affirmative action case, what they're really trying to do is to rewrite the meaning of the 14th Amendment, which was an amendment that was created in order to justify creating equality, doing race-aware policies in order to end past discrimination, and to revise all of this to be race-neutral, thus freezing in place inequality and freezing in place white supremacy. So they're trying to lay a groundwork here that actually is going to justify their continued ruling over the rest of us and make it that much harder for us to repair the damage that this faction has done over time. And what I think is really interesting when you're looking at the composite of the Supreme Court cases, even in the cases where we had good rulings, like there was a good ruling for us in which the Supreme Court decided to not further undermine the Voting Rights Act in Alabama. When you look at what happened in Alabama after they ruled to protect the Voting Rights Act, was a complete disregard for that rule. So like the MAGA Republicans in control of the Alabama state legislature said, these rules are for you, they're for other people, they're not for us, because we're going to be part of pushing forward the supremacy agenda. What we're really trying to highlight by going to DC was this agenda is one that is moving through the Supreme Court, trying to freeze inequality in place, trying to freeze white supremacy in place and bolster it for this wealthy white few, but it's also moving across the country. And so in state legislatures, we see anti-abortion bans, trampling of trans rights, a whole slew of attacks against our freedoms that are all part and parcel composite to take away our freedoms and actually entrench hierarchy for this supremacist faction. What we expect coming out of this session is a doubling down in state legislatures of all the things that they were touching on. So they ruled against affirmative action. We expect there's going to be a lot of policies coming up through state legislatures to rebuke DEI, to rip scholarships away from marginalized students, and to make it that much harder to challenge inequality in our law and in our policy. And this agenda is also going into our education system. So we're seeing an attempt to rewrite history and rewrite the knowledge of our past in order to justify why these hierarchies should be entrenched in order to protect this power. So this is kind of the composite agenda. I know we're going to be talking in detail about how this is affecting all these different organizations and communities, but we really see it as one agenda, right? And I think it's important for us to see as one agenda that is underway in order to entrench hierarchy in the places where it currently is and prevent us from repairing this injustice for our past. And so I'm going to hand it over to Anthony actually to talk a little bit more about that and how that's going.
Thanks, Nicole. And we're just a few weeks out from that DC action we mentioned earlier, where we sat in outside of Congress for 3 days, a couple nights. You know, it's been a really hot summer and it was 100 degrees every day. A couple dozen of us were out there really presenting a choice for our elected leaders, that this is a moment where they need to show which side they're on, and they need to demonstrate that they stand with the future, and the future is outside waiting and calling on them to act. And so in that, we launched our campaign to demand our members of Congress pledge to make freedom and equality real, which I'll come back to in a second, and to demonstrate exactly who is going to take a stand against this supremacist faction, which Nicole spoke quite a bit about. I'll just hammer home a couple points. This supremacist faction is the same faction who manufactured lies and laws to divide and control us for the past 400 years. Their strategy has been to deny our humanity and freedom based on who we are, what we look like, where we come from, all so they could exploit people, steal the wealth that we create, and grab power for themselves. They've had different names throughout our history. They've shape-shifted over time. They were enslavers, Gilded Age barons, Jim Crow segregationists in our past. And make no mistake, MAGA Republican politicians today are the modern iteration of this faction. And as Nicole mentioned, all of these political leaders who are pushing these attacks in our communities across our country are a part of this supremacist faction. All of these different attacks that we're seeing across the country right now that are making us angry and anxious are part and parcel of this faction's supremacy agenda. And they're moving this through their MAGA-run courts, the state legislatures and governorships they've seized, the House of Representatives that they took control of, to keep on profiting off of us and keep us from making this more equal future. So think of this supremacist faction and their supremacy agenda when we see MAGA justices banning efforts to create equality, or we see DeSantis whitewashing history in schools so they can justify inequality today, or when we see them wielding the House seats in state legislatures that they control to block the climate solutions our communities need, or to when the former MAGA president keeps trying to justify and try again to overthrow the will of the people, or from when they're taking away reproductive freedom or attacking trans youth and our freedom to be ourselves. This is all the same old playbook, and they're doing all this so desperately now because they're terrified of our generation. Indeed, they never wanted us, the most diverse generation in US history, to even exist. So we're onto them. We're organizing as Get Free young people to take a stand, just like past generations defeated this supremacist faction to win freedoms before. We're joining together to repair the historical and ongoing damage they've done and take back our future. So this month, we're bringing the movement that we launched in DC home and demanding every member of Congress show which side they're on by answering our pledge to make freedom and equality real. So we'll drop in the chat a couple links for how you can plug into Get Free's campaign and how you can follow what we're doing as well on social media. But this is a moment where we need to meet this moment in history, and we need elected leaders who will stand with our generation and do everything in their power to stand alongside us.
Thanks so much, Nicole and Anthony, for giving us, the overview of Get Free and how you all are building narrative, just underscoring what you were saying, Nicole, around, we have to understand as a movement, this is one agenda that we're all fighting. And I'm just so grateful for, the leadership capacity that you all are building, because I think we can, for someone that works in the climate space, I often say and speak to how, the injustices we see with climate change and the climate crisis, that's a leadership fail, because for too long, people like us have not been in leadership to make decisions about so many decisions that impact climate and what we're seeing play out right now. So thank you. We'll come back to y'all later as questions fill up the Q&A box. Right now I'm going to turn over to Meagan. One of the last times we were together, Meagan, was actually a year ago after SCOTUS decisions impacted the power of the Clean Air Act. And unfortunately, this specific issue has just continued to get worse. But for today's conversation, I just want to focus on what you all at Indivisible have been working on recently. So I see you all working on everything from defending democracy to fighting the MAGA movement. And so I'm curious, bird's eye view, how do you see these most recent SCOTUS decisions shaping the broader landscape of movement organizing now, especially considering, that Trump is rising in popularity despite the new indictments?
Yes. It's a good question. And I think everything we've been talking about has been so interlinked. I think, like you mentioned, the wildfires on Maui and Lahaina, and Anthony was talking about how hot it's been this summer. That's actually super linked to the Supreme Court also. They went after the Clean Water Act last year. They went after the Clean Air Act this year. It just makes it more and more difficult for those in charge to actually do something about these ongoing crises, because the court itself is interjecting where it shouldn't, and saying that, these experts don't have the authority, or Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate clean air and clean water. But that same thing is true for democracy as well. The court is interjecting itself into like the ballot box in ways that it really shouldn't be doing. And it's doing it for a reason. Like there's a very recent poll that showed 7 in 10 Americans, and this is across party lines, so not just, progressives, but everybody thinks 7 in 10 thinks that the court is too influenced by politics, and that their decision making is based on their personal political beliefs. And when you start to see numbers like that, that suggests a pretty severe failing in our democracy, that a critical institution in our democracy is no longer trusted by the American people. That institution derives its legitimacy from our belief in it. And so if we don't believe in it, it undermines the legitimacy of the court, which is not good for the ongoing health of our democracy for lots of different reasons. So basically, at Indivisible, what we're trying to do is really get folks to understand that link, that it, I think there's a tendency sometimes to kind of silo out our issues, like, well, I work on democracy and some people work on repro and some people work on this or that. But really, the right thinks of these things as interconnected. And I think it would really benefit all of us to think of it and think of those things in the same way. Like, it's not a mistake that the court 10 years ago gutted the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder, and then 10 years later overturned Roe v. Wade and said, well, if you have a problem with it, just vote out the people at the state level that you don't like, who are taking away your abortion rights, knowing full well that they've made it more difficult for you to vote. Like, those things are connected. And so we should be thinking about those things in the same way too. So as far as like building movements around that, I think there's one silver lining for how truly appalling the Supreme Court is, it's that they've gone too far. Like they've made themselves known to a group of people who would otherwise ignored that they even existed. And I would love to return to that myself. I'd love to return to that reality of not having no idea who Samuel Alito is, but no, we're stuck with that knowledge now. But it's like they overstepped. They were so eager to seize power for themselves and for their corporate benefactors that they weren't really that fussed if anyone noticed what they were doing. And the good news is that we all did, right? And it's made a huge difference. I think we've seen people get more engaged in the political process after Dobbs, after they overturned Roe v. Wade. People are becoming more and more aware of the court's, the role that the court plays in our ability to vote and our ability to determine who wins presidential elections and other federal elections, and the court's role in our climate and the temperature and the cleanliness of our air and water. All of those things come down to the court at the end of the day. So whatever it is that inspires folks to organize and be motivated and engage in politics and grassroots movements, all of those things are at risk in front of this like very out of control, very corporate Supreme Court that is not only undermining our rights from the bench, but like being rewarded with like lavish vacations on private jets and yachts. That's all part of the same power grab. And I think Nicole mentioned this too. Nicole and Anthony both mentioned that this is about control. And for them to say, you can't have bodily autonomy, but we can take free trips to Bali and face no consequences. Like it's all about control and power and who has it. So I think I think the conventional wisdom has been that folks on the right care more about the courts than folks on the left. That's not true anymore. And that's a good thing. There's lots of things that we can do as a movement to fight back against this court. And one of those things is, I wouldn't be me if I didn't come on a call and say this, we have got to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. You can impeach Supreme Court justices for bad behavior, but it's difficult. It's easier, believe it or not, to add 4 seats. And so what we need is the political will. So, expansion is very popular, relatively popular outside of Congress. There's like 51% of people across party lines support Supreme Court expansion. Our allies in Congress need to understand that they're behind and that they need to catch up, and that we need to build the political will to do something about a court that is undermining our democracy, undermining our bodily autonomy, and stripping us of fundamental constitutional rights that we thought were safe. So all that to say, that's like a key part of what Indivisible is going to be working on for as long as it takes, is to, when we talk about the health of our democracy, that conversation has to include the judiciary, and it has to include the Supreme Court as well.
Thank you so much, Meagan, for providing that landscape for us, and also for honing in on the critical importance of the role that control and power play a role into these conversations, and for flagging that, you know, these trips to Bali, these adventurous trips that are happening while folks are on the ground doing the work, and just like really like highlighting the importance of what is going on right now, and giving that context in terms of what Indivisible is doing to, you know, combat this. So next we're going to turn it over to Shelby. Shelby, you low-key made history this year by becoming the first Native person to lead the Transgender Law Center. And you are one of the first Native trans leaders to head a national LGBT organization. One of the Trans Law Center's priorities has been the trans agenda. Can you share with us what this is, why this is needed, and the work that y'all are doing to strengthen the political infrastructure so that trans and LGBT folks are safe?
That's a great question. Hi, everyone. My name's Shelby. It's so good to be here with all of you. And I also feel like I just learned a whole shit ton, so I'm excited about that. So I'll talk just for context. So TLC is an impact litigation organization, but we also do movement building. So years ago, we started doing public accommodations litigation cases, and then we took on more of criminalization cases. So we are actually this week in a hearing in Texas, we filed with the ACLU and Lambda Legal for Texas's heinous law sort of banning youth healthcare. We have a case against the Colorado prison system in Colorado. It's a class action lawsuit. So a myriad of cases, but really looking at not only how are our community's rights violated, but how are we further criminalized because of our trans identities, because of our racial identities and whatnot. So I'll kind of go back to like 2016, because I think that's like an important time to understand how we got here, because I'm sure all of you probably have turned on the news in the last year and seen some state doing something atrocious to trans people and just wondered like, wow, I didn't realize that we were living in the Stone Ages. But it turns out we are living in 2023, where trans kids are apparently the thing that everyone wants to target. So in 2016, Barack Obama was still the president. We thought we were like having a good life. And folks probably recall the House Bill 2 in North Carolina. It was the first sort of nationally known bathroom bill that was going to limit trans people from using a bathroom. There was good news, because immediately the Department of Justice was like, we're not going to stand for this, like advocates, everyone, it was national news. Like, we're good. Trans people we got your backs. I mean, I have to say, I cried a little bit. Loretta Lynch was like, we got your backs. It's all going to be all good. Fast forward 2023, we had over 500 anti-LGBT bills in state legislatures. So I think what folks are lifting up here is super critical. And of those, like 120 were anti-trans bills. And the sort of progression of anti-trans bills has been kind of obvious in some ways and slightly terrifying. So they started with bathrooms, which seems like totally, why bathrooms? Everyone's got to go to the bathroom. Then they moved to sort of sports. Well, let's limit kids and how they can play sports. Then fast forward, well, that doesn't work. We've totally gotten a handle on abortion. So let's go for trans healthcare, but let's not go for just any trans healthcare. Let's go for young people and their access to healthcare. And folks probably recall 2020, the governor of Texas sort of announced this directive that the attorney general was going to be investigating parents of trans kids, basically for child abuse, because they were supporting their trans kids. I say all that to say, like, it's a pretty nasty progression of how we've gotten here, but I think it makes sense that when they don't get one win, they go for the next egregious thing. And, you know, you've seen places like Missouri this year not only target trans youth healthcare, but adult access to healthcare. And it's a moment where I think we at TLC have kind of said, like, well, we need to sort of stand in our broader community and think about the intersections of this, because I've loved hearing what other folks have said, that it's just, this was very targeted, calculated attacks, putting certain people in positions of power that will limit everyone's bodily autonomy, whether that's voting rights, abortion access, healthcare, I mean, you name it, the climate, it's all there. So for us, we've been super rooted in community. And I think while the news is really horrific, I think we have to take a moment and celebrate the joy that we have in the world. I mean, young people today are sort of saying like, hey, listen, we actually know what we want, we know what we deserve, and we're going to fight for it. So I think the trans agenda for us came out of 2016. We convened about 30 trans leaders and said, like, what do we do in this moment? And they were very clear that we need to create sort of this North Star platform for trans community for all of our sort of partners and organizers and impacted communities to get behind and understand what are our issues. So it's a 5-point platform, and its first and number one priority is Black trans women and Black trans femmes leading and living fiercely, understanding that if we start to address systemic oppression and prioritize the most marginalized in our society, then everyone's free, which, you know, couldn't be more true in a moment that we're in right now. Other parts of it include like Beloved Home, which is looking at the intersections of migration and Indigenous sovereignty and how do we talk about that. And it also links to sort of how we're caring for our climate and our planet, both on a local and then global context. Those are just some of them. And what I think it's done for us is allowed us to have something to share with the world, to say like, you know what, you're lost and you're scared like us, like tap into this, be part of our world, join us in this, like activating this, whether that's in your local community, whether that's on a national scale. And it's really allowed us to have a sense of where we as an organization need to head. And it's allowed us to birth some really amazing new projects. We've launched, this year, we're launching a trans narrative lab, which is a really critical moment to think about the narrative storytelling work, but also the messaging work that we've been doing. Actually, with Anthony was helpful with us when they were at ASO around that. But thinking about how do we tell the stories of trans people? Because largely, it's like most Americans are supportive of trans people, but we're not getting their stories out there in the world. We're not telling the stories from our own perspective. We're letting other people control our narrative. So that's like step number one, which seems pretty key. And then another thing, which is sort of like part 2 of the trans agenda, is what we're called building trans power. For context, like, you know, I think most of us know that trans people started sort of the modern LGBT movement. But if you look at sort of historically where we came into like becoming formal organizations and infrastructure, like a tiny, tiny percentage of LGBT philanthropy goes to trans-led work. So part of that is thinking, how do we support the capacity that's been built over the last 2-3 decades around trans leadership? There's amazing trans organizations throughout the country. How do we lift them up? And how do we build trans power and work together, knowing that TLC has one lane, our partners have other lanes, and then there's community in every state that we're part of, to really lift up this sort of resiliency and survival that we're in. And then I think another key aspect for us that's been really key is to do some learning outside of our sort of LGBT umbrella. I don't want to discount that our fight is serious, it is long, it is hard, but also we did a ton of learning from abortion and repro groups in the last couple of years to understand how do we think about practical care funds for people whose healthcare is banned and become illegal. How do we think about just getting sort of mutual aid efforts within communities so people are aware? Another big step that we've done is starting to offer sort of digital security and safety trainings for folks through partnerships with organizations like Vision Change Win, and thinking about like, how do we meet this moment? Because if we stand alone, we're not going to get free. And if we kind of stand together and understand that folks might not always know how to show up for trans people, but people are certainly down in this moment. I think for us is kind of where we're coming at that work from. And, you know, I think we're also just as an organization, I'll close with this, like people think that because we're an impact litigation organization, that the only thing we want to do and focus on is litigation. And I think what makes us unique and really so successful in this moment with movement building is that litigation is just one tool in a toolbox that is going to right now limit some of our harm. And I did see sort of a comment in the questions around SCOTUS. I mean, I don't need to say what everyone else has said. Like, it is a very dangerous time for anything to go to the Supreme Court. So I think on our end, we're working as hard as we can to keep things in the lower courts, knowing that the second we start to head towards the Supreme Court, there will be dire consequences for trans people, just like there has been with abortion and restrictions on abortion. So I think that's kind of where we're at. And I'm just super excited to be here with all of you and see how this is all connected. So shout out to y'all for bringing us together.
I mean, it's a real honor to have all of you here, and just to connect, and also to, you know, speak with the audience here about all the different roles you all are playing and the roles that your organizations play around liberation for all of us. And thank you, Shelby. I just really appreciate you sharing context. It's so important to know, you know, the path of how we and the various journeys of how we got to where we are now. So I learned a lot just now. Thank you. And yeah, now moving to you, Matthew. Thank you so much for sticking with us here and for your patience. So your focus is on federal Indian law and tribal law. I think most Natives who are here with us in the audience today know that we had a big win during the various SCOTUS decisions with ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. But then there was also the Department of Interior versus Navajo Nation case, which did not end up in favor of the tribes. And of course, there was also affirmative action that impacts Native people and so many people. And there were more cases, of course. So I guess this is another bird's eye view question. Do you think this round of SCOTUS decisions was positive for Indian country? And when it comes to protecting our sovereignty, what do organizers and activists need to be thinking about given the political landscape that everyone here, all these speakers have been talking about?
Yeah, thank you, Jada. It's really great to be on your call today, and happy to be and honored to be invited. So yeah, you really nailed it. We had a case this year called Holland versus Brackeen, which was a challenge to the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is indisputably a bedrock civil rights statute, right, from 1978 in the context of Indian affairs, that no court in the history of the statute for more than 4 decades really seriously challenged its constitutionality. But as others on this call have mentioned, there are a bunch of lower court judges put on there by Trump and others who are absolutely radicalized. The law doesn't matter to them. We've got a couple of judges on the Supreme Court right now that are, I guess at least one of them technically isn't a Trump judge, but we'll call him Clarence Thomas, and another called Samuel Alito, who are really enthusiastic about tearing down all of Indian law. Anything that is beneficial to Indian people or tribal nations is subject to their derision. They are openly disgusted by this very idea that Congress could pass a law that is designed to prevent racism or to enhance tribal sovereignty. And you know, the challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act sort of has its origins in virulently racist language from Justice Alito in a case, a previous case on the Indian Child Welfare Act from 2013, where he basically just said, I think this is unconstitutional. And so it really galvanized right-wing organizations such as the Goldwater Institute to start raising funds to attack the Indian Child Welfare Act. And they weren't even really sure how to do it. But they have basically infinite resources, and they've got a lot of allies. And the money that, as far as we can understand, as far as we understand, that the bulk of the money really is from the oil and gas industry. And so there's been a lot of talk and consternation about why is it that oil and gas is so interested in what's going on in Indian country. You know, while this case was pending a few years ago, the Supreme Court decided a case again in favor, a huge case in favor of tribal interests called McGirt versus Oklahoma, which was about reservation boundaries. And what the fun thing about reservation boundaries and Indian country generally is that if you're inside of Indian country, tribes and the United States government have primary jurisdiction over everybody within the territory of an Indian reservation. So that directly cuts to the issue of who has control over pollution and polluters inside of Indian country, i.e. oil and gas, coal, extractive natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and so if you have expanded and enhanced powers of tribal nations within larger territories, within over oil and gas, you have a lot of terrified oil, you know, multinational corporations, and they're throwing a lot of money and resources, both loudly and quietly, against tribal nations. And, you know, I think that's where a lot of this has come from. They don't really care about children at all. These are organizations that really could give a shit about children. But what they're interested in doing is weakening the powers of Congress in a couple of different ways. One is to reinforce the powers of tribes to regulate people and industries within their reservations. And the other is to help to correct and prevent ongoing structural and historic racism against Indian people and others. And so there's a lot of power arrayed against tribal nations. And that in some respects, that's a really good thing, because there are a lot of tribal governments here. I'm in Michigan. We have 12 tribal governments here who will lay down on the train tracks to stop things like pipelines that are running through Line 5 and Line 3 that are running through the Great Lakes. They're dedicating resources that they probably can't really afford to try to protect the resource, protect treaty rights, protect habitats. We're sitting on the largest body of fresh water in most of the world, if not the entire world right now. And this is what Michigan tribes are really into, Great Lakes tribes in general. And it makes absolute sense that oil and gas industry, extractive resources industries would come after us with everything they have. And it's also quite terrifying, because as everybody on this call has already identified, this court has a supermajority of radicalized conservative judges. This is quite possibly the most conservative, most radical Supreme Court in the history of the Supreme Court. And we're talking about 19th century judges who are happy to reaffirm slavery and completely undermine the rights of women and people of color and everything. That's basically where we are right now. We have a antebellum South Supreme Court at this point, pre-Civil War. So it's super scary. You might ask, why on earth did the tribes win this case? Why is the Indian Child Welfare Act even constitutional anymore? And really what that case ultimately ended up being about is power of Congress, which bleeds into the second case you mentioned, the Interior case against the Navajo Nation. The tribe sued over water rights. They just want an accounting of what water rights they have. And the court wasn't even willing to give an order to the United States to say, here's what the water rights of the Navajo Nation are. And these are, in some ways, are the same case. The first case is the powers of Congress to pass Indian affairs laws. And the other is the power of Congress to do whatever it wants in Indian affairs. And I really think that the Indian Child Welfare Act survived in large part because, if you struck down any of the Indian Child Welfare Act on any ground, the next thing to go are the statutes that criminalize and federalize Indian country criminal jurisdiction. And, one thing the Supreme Court has always been supportive of when it comes to Congress is throwing Indian people in jail. And, we talk a lot about in Indian country of rising crime rates and missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. And that's all very serious, but that's not what this court is interested in. And it's really not what Congress is interested in. There is a strong interest, along with oil and gas, in the prison industrial complex, which is a really serious thing. So I'll conclude by saying, Indian country, a lot of tribal nations are doing a lot of really good things right now. Some of the tribes have resources, and they're dedicating those resources to things like the survival of the planet, to fighting climate change. And, that's a new thing for tribal nations. I mean, we've always been in that view, but now we finally have some economic and political oomph, and we're going to use it, and they're coming after us. So bring it on, motherfuckers.
Yes, Matthew. I really appreciated how you tied or connected the dots between oil and gas and their, the special interests around these cases. And it really did speak to what Meagan was saying earlier around how the right is really good at, kind of seeing like the holistic picture around how to build power and how to take control and take that power. And oil and gas has been a part of their agendas in maintaining and taking that power. So I wanted to transition into beginning to close out. We're reaching the top of the hour. Thank you again to all of the speakers for being here with us. Thank you to the audience members for joining, especially those on the East Coast. It's later over there. But I know that Shelby has a time limit, and I just want to give space for them to share any last words, and then I have a final lightning round question for the rest of the speakers. So Shelby, any final words?
I think Matthew's ending was too perfect to add, so I'll leave it at that, and that's my wisdom for today.
Great. Yeah, just echoing that perfect sentiment, Matthew. I think it speaks to how all of us feel ultimately. Well, thank you, Shelby. And yeah, well, I did drop some links to the website and to the trans agenda for liberation in the chat, and I'll do so again so that people have access to that. Yeah, follow them and keep, yeah, just support their work. Okay, so lightning round for the rest of the panel before we end. How can our listeners take action and support the work that you are all stewarding? How can we continue to combat these forces and organize forward so that we can see more wins for our frontline Black, Brown, Indigenous, low-income communities? I'll call on, we'll go in the same order we started. Nicole and Anthony first.
Oh, come on. Okay. Yeah, I'll be really quick. And then Anthony can probably give some more stuff. But I think the one thing to realize is that all this is happening because we are so powerful right now. So even though it feels like an onslaught, it's happening now because we are many, we are clear, we're powerful, and we're about to take everything from these people, which is why they're fighting so hard. So if you can, get involved, join an organization like Get Free. We're building power, youth power, in order to fight back, repair the harm that's been done, and create the future we deserve. There are a few places to plug in. I'll leave it to Anthony to share that, but really let that guide you as you take action and really see everything is connected, because this is one agenda once again. The oil and gas industries, the wealthy people bribing Clarence Thomas, they are not new, they are old. This has been deeply entrenched in this country since before it was founded, and this is our chance to actually get at it at the root.
And I'll just add that just as the supremacist faction has this historic legacy, we have a legacy too. We come from a history where our ancestors have come together time and again to win freedoms, to make a better future, to defeat this faction. And that's also why they're so terrified of us now. So absolutely plug into the organizations that are on this webinar, and you can get involved with Get Free's campaign by taking our pledge to get free and demand that our elected leaders stand with the future.
Yeah, I think I'll. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I thought we were just going. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think I'll just echo all that same thing. I think if folks want to get more involved in preserving our democracy and fighting back against, MAGA, Trump, and those same forces that are currently on the Supreme Court, because MAGA-ism is bigger than just Donald Trump as an individual. You can go to indivisible.org. Actually, in about a week, we're going to be updating our site with a lot of different campaign materials that will have toolkits for how to engage on court reforms, especially the Judiciary Act and Supreme Court expansion. I think I think the push to add seats to the Supreme Court is going to be one of those like big righteous fights of our lives. It's going to take some time to build up support for it. So this is not something that I think is going to happen overnight, but it is critically important for the future health of our democracy to have a Supreme Court that functions. Like, end of sentence. Right now, I think our allies in Congress have been incredibly slow to acknowledge the existential threat that the Supreme Court poses to all of us. And I know that sounds dramatic, but it is also happens to be true, particularly if you are a person of color, Indigenous, like that's who they're coming after is all of us. So I think it's going to be really important when you're talking to your members of Congress to say, what is your plan to deal with the Supreme Court? Because like hoping for the best is not a strategy to restore our fundamental rights. Like there was a recent study that showed that if Democrats do nothing about the Supreme Court, the soonest we could regain a Democratic majority on the Supreme Court is 60 years from now. So I would be 102 And I hope I live that long, but I would love to have a functional Supreme Court before I hit my own personal centennial. So those are the sorts of questions we should be bringing to our members of Congress. What's your plan to deal with this completely out of control Supreme Court that is attacking our democracy and our rights? Because doing nothing really isn't an option. And then really show them that it is in fact safe to embrace big solutions to this very big problem. And that is expansion. So yes, our website's indivisible.org, and please keep checking back in because we'll have a ton more resources in about a week from now. So sorry about the bad timing, but really hope that we can keep working together on this critical issue.
Thank you, Meagan. Matthew?
Yeah, I guess I would say that on a really big picture view of things, it seems like that other than maybe somehow getting an expansion of the Supreme Court, the places and the states that have been really successful in sort of turning things around are those who have been able to fight against political and racial gerrymandering. I think that is, I know it's been just an unbelievably dramatic change here in the state of Michigan. I mean, Michigan went for Trump in 2016, and just this last time around, the last time we had an election, 2022, for the first time ever, the Democrats are in charge of, have control of the governorship, the legislature, and the Michigan Supreme Court. And it's never happened here. And it's really because of the sort of creating a neutral body that will allow for voting districts. And I think that's something that's very viable. It's happening in Wisconsin, which is a critically important state for national politics. And you're never going to win over Mississippi and Alabama and Florida and places like that. But, if you can really get a strong control of Congress and the Senate and the House, I think that's, and we have the numbers. And the weird thing is we should be in total control of the popular branches of government. I understand why this would be an issue. And control of Congress and the presidency absolutely makes the Supreme Court utterly irrelevant. It really does. There's only so much they can do. We just keep passing laws and they can strike them down, but here's the secret of the Supreme Court. These are also a bunch of old, lazy people. When I was in law school in the 90s, they decided 150 cases a year. And 10 years before that, it was 200 cases a year. Now they decide 50 cases a year and then immediately go off on their little private jet trips to whatever they're doing. They don't actually work very hard. So you can inundate them with great lower court decisions and, they become irrelevant.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you to all of the incredible speakers for sharing your insight and your wisdom with us today. Just as a reminder, we recorded this session and we'll be sharing the recording after the call. It's super important that we continue to create spaces like these where we can share our insights, share our knowledge. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I feel really confident knowing that there's leadership like this out there that's stewarding critical work to keep our communities safe. So thank you, everyone. Yupai Chani. Thank you, Jade. And I hope that everyone has an amazing rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.